The demographics show muscle loss as we age as a sort of a situation that we just have to accept because of age, but that's not the case.
So let's talk about protein. Now, it seems to be getting its time in the spotlight. We seem to like to go through all the macronutrients. We've done fat, we've done carbs, we're now seemingly onto protein. And you go into supermarkets now and there's just high protein products everywhere. So, just to set the scene, what does the science actually say? Is this a trend backed by evidence, or is this just the food industry's latest kind of marketing angle?
As you say, it's hypes. I mean, when I started my career, I was working on substrates for energy metabolism, so mainly carbohydrates and fats. So I was focusing most on carbohydrate availability for athletes and mostly endurance athletes. Then, as time progressed, I was thinking more in the line of exercise from people with chronic metabolic disease. And then, of course, the utilization of fat in the muscle, fat in the organs is important. So then it was about fat intake and fat use. And the last 20 years, I've been focusing more on protein. So, in other words, hypes and popular themes within science shift in time, but in the end, there's three macronutrients: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And in the end, we're simply talking about food. So I think protein in the past, it was all about carbohydrates and fats, and people do not realize how important proteins are because we are mainly protein. And so I think it's good to see that topic, and it also transfers to a lot more interest in the general public, but also the scientists and also the field. Yeah, I mean, but there's a lot of crap in the media, of course, and superficiality, and often the nuance is lost. But yeah, that's why it's a hype.
Well, let's understand a little bit of the basic science. There'll be people listening at all levels of understanding of this topic already. Why do we eat protein? What actually happens to it in our bodies?
So we can talk about any tissue in the body, but most people are always interested in muscles. So I'll stick to the muscle as an example, but I could make this example for basically any living tissue. All our tissues, including muscle, are constantly being broken down and built up again. So our muscle is composed of muscle proteins, and these proteins are constantly being refurbished. So they are broken down back to its building blocks, the amino acids, and built up again. And for muscle, that is the turnover rate, which they call it, is 1 to 2% per day. So to make it not more complicated, in fact, you can basically say that around Christmas, this arm is a new arm. You haven't noticed it, but everything has been broken down and built up again, so it stays fresh. So every 50 to 100 days, 1 to 2% turnover per day, means you have completely renewed your muscle. Something that you don't realize until you end up in hospital, you stop eating, or you become immobilized for some reason. But that is what happens. So your muscle is dynamic. All these tissues are constantly being synthesized and broken down. And that allows us to adapt to, for example, different types of exercise. Look at an endurance athlete versus a bodybuilder, completely different phenotype.
Now, we're going to focus a bit more on the muscular side of things, but just out of curiosity, what are the other critical functions of protein in the body that make it so essential?
Anything. I mean, basically everything except for some fat and some carbohydrates. Most of our body is composed of proteins, and these proteins are basically your skin, your liver, your brain, but also the enzymes you produce to digest your foods. Everything is protein.
Now, are there any concerns or downsides to how our bodies process protein? Things that we should be aware of as we think about optimal intake?
Yeah, I mean, that is a lot of discussions that are there. I mean, there's estimations that the body produces about 250 to 300 grams of proteins on a daily basis. That is the proteins you refurbish to stay intact, to maintain your arm, to secrete enzymes. So that's 250 to 300 grams of protein. Now, you ingest on a daily basis about, say, 70 grams of protein. So that means your body is constantly also recycling building blocks. It's recycling amino acids. So it's really funny that your body is constantly turning over everything, and then you consume some of the protein in order to refresh the building blocks, and you lose about 70 grams of protein as well. And so that is how you maintain your body. Now, of course, people then started doing studies to see how much protein you require to stay alive, healthy. And then the WHO has actually set that at 0.83 grams of protein per kilogram body mass per day. And that allows you to stay in balance. They call that nitrogen balance, that there's as much nitrogen. Amino acids contain a lot of nitrogen. So when the nitrogen goes into the body and the nitrogen that leaves the body, mainly through measuring urine, that balance is achieved for everybody at a protein intake of 0.83 grams of protein per kilogram body mass per day. But most of us actually consume well above that.
Okay, so what happens if we consistently don't get enough? You mentioned we probably do, but if we didn't, especially as we age, what does that actually look like in someone's life?
So, for example, that if we start not eating enough and our protein intake gets below those levels, you actually start losing muscle. And we see this, for example, in frail elderly people in the intensive care where the feeding is not optimal. But of course, there's also the disease itself and the reason for the admission. So, insufficient protein will at some point lead to muscle loss, and in the end, it will lead to massive also health loss, of course.
Now, people earlier in life, are there any indications that they're not getting enough? Again, you mentioned we probably get enough, but those that don't, are there signs and symptoms to watch out for?
Of course, if you look, I mean, it's not our expertise, and there's not that much work done mechanistically in children. But you know that if children do not eat enough food and do not eat enough protein, that they have stunted growth.
Now, there's huge debate about plant versus animal proteins, the source of protein. What does the science actually show about their differences for building muscle and health?
So first of the things that you have to understand is the stimulation of muscle building is mainly done by two anabolic stimuli. One is physical activity, and the other one is protein intake. Because if you ingest protein, the protein is digested in your gastrointestinal tract. The amino acids are being absorbed. They are released. Most of them are released in the circulation, in your blood. They reach the muscle, and there they activate all pathways that stimulate muscle building. So food intake stimulates muscle synthesis, muscle protein synthesis. And the way that this process is stimulated is largely attributed to the speed and the concentration of the essential amino acids after a meal. So when a protein is rapidly digested, contains a lot of essential amino acids, and especially the amino acid leucine, you get a stronger stimulation of muscle protein synthesis. Now, then I automatically come to plant-based proteins. If you ingest plant-based proteins as a whole food source, then the body has a little bit more difficulty to digest that protein and extract that protein. So the digestibility of plant-based food sources is more complex and more complicated than animal-derived protein sources. That's one. Now, the research that has been done is mainly on proteins that have been isolated from plant-based sources and animal-based sources. So protein powders basically for the general public. If you compare plant-based proteins with animal-derived proteins, so powders coming from a plant, powders coming from animal sources, then we still see that there's a tendency of a greater stimulation of muscle protein synthesis with the animal-derived protein sources when compared with the plant-derived protein sources. That is explained or attributed to the fact that there's more delayed digestion and absorption, but the differences are small because the main issue is if you have whole food sources, there the digestibility is still an issue, but also because most of the plant-based protein sources are deficient in one or more specific amino acids, often methionine or leucine. And so you miss some of the building blocks. So that is the reason why typically at small amounts, we see that plant-derived proteins do not have the same anabolic properties as animal-derived protein sources. But similar to chew beer, you can compensate for lesser quality by greater quantity. So if you simply eat a little bit more, you compensate for any deficiencies and you're still fine.
Okay, so in terms of food and protein stimulating muscle building, is that something that can occur independent of exercise, or do you need the both together?
I'm still surprised and I always find it amazing how the body actually does this, but simply eating protein, digesting protein, allowing the amino acids to reach the circulation and reach the muscle, that directly stimulates muscle protein synthesis. So yes, simply eating protein stimulates muscle protein synthesis. The same thing happens with physical activity, does the same thing. And what is even more cool is that when you combine these two things, if you actually perform exercise and you then eat protein, then more of the protein that you ingest will actually be used for muscle protein building. So it's not only about eating protein, it's about having that synergy between physical activity and protein ingestion. Because you can actually, with the same amount of protein that you ingest, you can build more protein when there's physical activity in play. And so simply eating protein is not going to make you 150 kilograms of pure muscle mass, but it's the combination of physical activity or physical inactivity and protein intake that define what actually happens.
So there's been quite a bit of increasing work recently on specific amino acids, and you're heavily involved in that as well. Some seemingly good, like leucine, and then you hear about some with potential concerns, like methionine. What does the average listener need to know about amino acid specifics?
For now, I don't think anything. So the only thing that you will hear a lot and see in the supermarket shelves or in supplements is often the discussion about branched chain amino acids and leucine. And leucine is one of the branched chain amino acids. And we know that leucine is one of the amino acids that is very potent in stimulating those anabolic pathways after food intake. And that is the reason why people believe that products or proteins which have a higher leucine content are typically also capable of stimulating protein synthesis to a great extent. And this has been verified with, for example, adding free leucine to meals or different proteins with a low leucine content to show that you get a greater response. Of course, this is all academic research. This is not directly translatable to meals or how people eat themselves. But that is something that we know now a lot from leucine. And of course, there's also now more and more studies coming out on specific amino acid feedings in animals, for example. But this is a completely separate, this is not something that you can easily translate to a human diet where we don't consume individual amino acids or we don't consume proteins with a deficiency of a specific amino acid, because most humans do not consume a single protein or an amino acid diet. With methionine, I don't have anything to say because this is just confusing your audience, because there's studies where they show that if they add a specific amino acid or they remove a certain amino acid, that it has an effect on animals. But what you're doing is something that you will never do in humans because you don't consume a diet that is deprived of a specific amino acid or something like that. We don't even eat one single protein, which animals of course do if they get fed only, for example, corn. So it's completely irrelevant and it only confuses the general public.
So just to clarify, can a plant-based eater, a specifically plant-based eater, get all of the amino acids they need? Obviously, they're deficient or low in certain amino acids, but if they eat enough plants, can they get enough for health, I guess?
Yes, that's a simple answer. Most plant-based proteins can have a deficiency in one or more specific amino acids, but there's so many different plant-based proteins, and where some are deficient in one amino acids, other are deficient in another amino acid. So if you have a diet that combines all of these different proteins, then it's unlikely that you actually develop a specific amino acid deficiency. The only thing is that if you do not consume enough food, and of course, with a plant-based food, your digestibility of protein is less, you can have a risk of not consuming enough protein. But if you're healthy, you're active, you consume a lot of food, you already compensate for lower quality by greater quantity.
Okay, so you mentioned already some of the guidelines and what the recommendations are. I wanted to ask, I know we're all different, obviously, but how much protein do we actually need? Have the guidelines got it correct? Would science agree with the current guidelines? Do we need a little more, a little less? Let's start with just a general recommendation for the average person. And then if there's any subgroups of people that you want to mention who may need to alter that amount.
You have to have a guideline in order to help people, but science is, of course, much more complex than defining a simple guideline. On nitrogen balance studies in the past, it was clear that the WHO set a guideline of 0.83 grams of protein per kilogram body mass per day as an amount that allows most people to maintain a nitrogen balance, meaning as much protein goes in as much protein goes out in the form of nitrogen. Now, I don't think that will change a lot, but you have to understand that this is in a certain population, under a certain condition, with a habitual protein intake. So I think this is a good one. This is a minimal amount, but it's certainly not the optimal amount. Not that you need to worry about this. Most people, most normal, active, healthy people, they will consume between 1 and 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body mass per day, you and me, and most of the listeners. If you're very active and you're exercising more, you simply also eat more. And when you eat more, you also eat more protein. And then a lot of active athletes will actually easily go up to 1.5, even without taking supplements.
Are there any subgroups like women at certain stages of life or the elderly who may need to be more conscious of how much they're eating?
Very good. Under conditions where you're trying to lose weight and you reduce food intake, or when you become older, hospitalized, frail, and you can't eat a lot, and you don't have the sense of eating a lot, then your total food intake goes down up to a level that your protein intake goes down to a level where it's actually insufficient. Frail elderly, people trying to lose a lot of weight, people recovering from surgery in the hospital, those are all situations where protein intake is generally too low to be optimal.
Now, I struggle, and I'm sure a lot of people struggle with numbers 0.83 per this, per that. For those that kind of struggle with counting grams and doing the math, what does that actually look like on a plate? Can you give some kind of practical examples of what enough protein would look like in a meal?
I like that question. And to first start off with, most people, I'm not sure your audience, but most of the people that pick up papers or stuff in the social media, they're actually pretty good at numbers because they know exactly how much protein powders they're consuming. But when I'm asking them how much protein they're consuming in their normal diet, they have no clue. So that is already an issue with supplements because supplements is something that you supplement on top of your diet. Whether you need a supplement depends on what you consume in your diet, and that's exactly what they generally don't know. So that is something that you need to know. And half a liter of milk, 2 big glasses of milk is about 20 grams of protein. 2 to 3 eggs is about 20 grams of protein. Between 70 and 100 grams of meat or fish or chicken is 20 grams of protein. A coffee cup full of nuts, that's 20 grams of protein. And 20 grams of protein is what is typically suggested as the amount that can stimulate muscle building for up to about 4 to 6 hours after a meal.
So, what are some of the superstar sources of protein? You've mentioned some there, but are there any things that you eat that you've chosen based on what you know? And I guess a second part to that question is if you are a bit more of a plant based eater, what are some of the plant based sources that are particularly high in lysine and methionine?
If we go and talk about different proteins, then of course the animal derived proteins have an amino acid composition that is very much resembling our own tissues. That's why they call it high quality. So a very balanced amino acid composition. And then you have to think about meat, fish, chicken, milk protein, cheese, eggs, and stuff like that. From the plant based sources, I think most people now already know, I mean, soy, nuts, these things. But particularly, I think from the plant based, you should never look at a specific protein. For plant based, it's important to have a diverse diet with all different types of plant based foods because all of them have specific deficiencies. I mean, for example, corn has a huge leucine content, even higher than whey protein, but it can be deficient in lysine and methionine. So basically, think in meals, don't think in single proteins. From a health perspective, if you have a normal diet, I don't see any health issues with consuming meat, fish, or chicken, or dairy, plant based. I think it's a a good mix and whether the best mix is a 40-60 or a 60-40 or 50-50. I mean, in the Western world, it's generally like 60-40. In the rest of the world, so the less privileged world is the other way around. But they're catching up and we're actually going the other way. So I think that doesn't make a whole lot of difference. I think the most reasons to cut down on dairy or meat is generally for other reasons. It's for sustainability, it's for animal health and stuff like that. I think from a health perspective, the body doesn't discriminate that much. It just needs the amino acids. And if it gets too many amino acids that they don't need, they will burn them or excrete them. And they will use the amino acids that they get. The body doesn't care where the protein comes from.
Is there a limit to how much protein the body can handle in one sitting? Can you consume what you need in a day in one meal, or is it better to have a little bit of protein across all the meals?
In healthy young adults, if you give 20 grams of protein, you see a stimulation of muscle protein synthesis for up to 4 to 6 hours. Based on that, people have suggested that it would be best, and I still agree with that, with 3 or 4 meals throughout the day, nicely distributed throughout the day with 20 to 25 grams of each main meal. But of course, when this comes in social media, people start worrying about, did I actually ingest my supplement or my meal immediately after the exercise session or whatever, and then stress because they haven't timed their protein well. For that reason, we did a study where we provided people with 100 grams of protein, a single bolus, not to convince people to start doing that, simply to show that if you consume more protein, that the body will take more time to digest and absorb the amino acids, and you get a greater or longer stimulation of muscle protein synthesis. So that also explains why people do not rapidly lose muscle when they start intermittent feeding or time-restricted feeding. So yes, with a greater bolus, you'll have a longer response.
Have you any other tips around getting the most from your protein? For example, Keith Bauer, who you know, and I think he stole a quote from one of your research papers, was eating mince, you get more protein extraction than eating a steak. And correct me if I've got that wrong. But any little tips, other little tips around getting the most from your protein, like do you acquire or consume it better at certain times of the day, or the timing of it around exercise? Any little tips or pearls about how to get the most of it?
Yeah, so it's not as sexy as you would like it to have on social media. It's the stuff that your mom actually told you does actually help you with stimulating muscle protein building after a meal. Sitting upright and chewing well are two factors that we have proven that directly affect the digestion, the rate of digestion and absorption of your protein. So yes, chewing well, sitting upright while you eat are two factors. Consuming some protein after exercise, does it mean to have to be immediately after exercise an hour? No, don't worry about it. Simply, if you have an exercise session, for example, most of us still have work, so we actually exercise in the evening. Ensure that you have a protein-rich snack after your exercise session. Could also be a little bit later meal. So distribute your timing of your protein so that you also ingest some protein after your exercise session. And I think those are some of the key things that you can actually take home.
Just out of curiosity, what does the sitting up do? I kind of understand why the chewing might be helpful, but what does the sitting upright do?
So this was a fun discussion. I think we once had in an Irish pub where one of the postdocs, Andy, said like, yeah, Luke, but how could we ever figure out whether body position is an important factor in digestion and absorption? I assume we can't hang people upside down in the lab. And I said, Andy, why not? So we actually bought one of those inversion tables and we put people upside down and we did a study to see whether hanging nearly upside down has an effect on digestion and absorption, and that is a huge effect. Simply gastric emptying, of course, because there's no gravity pulling the food down towards your duodenum. And then you think like, why would you do something like that? Because it's not rocket science. No, it's not rocket science, but it's something that hasn't been done, which is not necessarily a reason to do it. But think about space and staying in space. There's also no gravity of your food pulling down. When we saw that those differences were huge and actually much bigger than the effects of comparing, for example, whey and casein, we decided to follow up on that study and to see what happens when people lie down or sit upright, whether that also has a measurable effect. And it did, it was a huge effect. And of course, that is very relevant. Think of a hospital, people in intensive care units, people lying in bed and being fed. How is it different when we actually put them upright and actually let them consume the food sitting upright? Also, huge effects. These effects are actually at least in the same area as comparing whey protein versus casein or something like that. So also sitting upright, allowing maximal gastric emptying, having a rapid release of protein-derived amino acids in the circulation, all helps in contributing, getting that postprandial response, thereby stimulating muscle protein synthesis.
Now, we should discuss supplements, I guess. I mean, they are everywhere. What's your general viewpoint? I know, I guess it's different for everyone, but who needs supplements?
Who needs supplements? Probably not the people using them. I think there's two ways or two reasons to take supplements in protein when your total protein intake in your diet is too low or when the quality of protein in your diet is insufficient. So that automatically brings us to people that are stressing their body to a higher level in order to induce an adaptive response. That could be people recovering from an injury or from surgery, but also athletes trying to gain weight. Now, for athletes trying to gain weight or becoming a better athlete, they are typically very active and they already consume more protein simply because they eat more. If they try to do that while actually also reducing food intake and energy intake, that's where supplements are helpful because you need to consume a more protein dense diet. And a more protein dense diet, meaning you have to eat more products that are more protein dense, or, which is often much more simple, is taking supplements. The greater needs is, of course, with older, frail people recovering from surgery, still in the hospital. We know that those people actually consume only half or even one third of their protein requirements.
Would that advice stand, generally speaking, for high protein foods? You know, these aisles of high protein foods. Can the majority of us ignore those aisles? And perhaps they maybe have a use for those people that you've just mentioned.
Yes, I mean, a lot of the sports nutrition supplements can actually be used also in clinical care and the other way around. But what is interesting, a lot of the products that I see in the supermarkets, which they now state high protein, are the same products that were there before without actually saying high protein. So a lot of these products is basically also good education for the consumer by telling you, did you know that there's a lot of protein in, I don't know, cottage cheese or in eggs, or a lot of people don't even know. So high protein often doesn't mean enriched with protein. A lot of the dairy now says high protein. It was already high protein 10 years ago. In addition, you have, of course, products where they added additional protein. Now, is that necessary if you have a healthy diet and you consume in an energy balance? Probably not, unless you're trying to lose a lot of weight and therefore you're not eating a lot of foods, or when you're frail and you can't eat a lot of food. In those conditions, when total energy intake goes down, then you want a more protein dense foods. And that can be protein dense foods that have always been protein dense, or specific products that are now being made that are fortified with protein.
Probably a good time to ask that question. You kind of alluded to it there, but obviously GLP-1 agonists now are all over the place. They're huge, becoming very popular, and probably being maybe, dare I say, misused a little bit by the general public. And I don't know that a lot of people taking them are getting nutritional advice. Anything you want to say, or anything the science is currently showing us about the impact of these drugs on muscle mass?
Yeah, I mean, we're still at the brink of the use and we don't know what is happening, but we know that people, of course, are being facilitated in dramatically reducing their total food intake. And if you reduce your total food intake, that's, of course, a good thing if you're overweight and you want to lose excess fat. But you might actually compromise yourself from sufficient micronutrients, but also protein. And that's why the industry is now actually looking for a lot of products that are nicely matched with GLP-1 receptor agonist treatment, which are fortified products. But of course, you can also just choose more protein dense foods. I think anybody that chooses a weight loss strategy using these pharmaceutical agents, if they decide to do that, beware that you still try to consume a healthy diet, which is difficult if you stop eating. Quality becomes more important when total quantity is reduced. So, in any situation where you can't eat another food or you decide not to eat enough food, it becomes even more important what you eat.
I guess we've probably covered quite a few in this talk already, but are there any other misconceptions about protein that you'd like to clear up?
I mean, we get a lot of questions about, for example, collagen protein, gelatin, hydrolyzed collagen, whatever you want to call it, which basically is a low quality protein because it hasn't got a lot of essential amino acid. It has a lot of glycine and protein. And because a lot of your connective tissues also have a lot of glycine and protein, it's being advocated and advertised in the media. So far, at least for muscle, we haven't seen benefits of collagen. It might be relevant for example, recovery from surgery when you have a lot of requirement for glycine and protein, but so far we haven't seen any data to confirm that.
Speaking of collagen, there may be a lot of women listening who feel a pressure. There's a lot of pressure in the media now about taking collagen supplements, probably primarily more for skin, but maybe for other reasons as well. Is there good evidence to support that?
So we haven't done a lot with skin, but a few years ago, we started actually taking skin biopsies when we were taking muscle biopsies, just to figure out whether the skin actually responds to protein ingestion just the way that muscle responds to protein ingestion. But so far, we haven't seen any evidence that the skin protein synthesis actually responds to nutritional intake.
Could I talk a little bit about current research? Anything that you're excited about? Any research that maybe is in the not too distant future that you'd like to let us know about?
We have worked a lot on muscle, and the last few years we have been diverting a little bit to other tissues because I'm interested to see what the turnover is of other tissues. And so we now, of course, you can't take biopsies from all these other organs, but we do this in combination with surgeons here at the hospital. So we look at turnover rates of, for example, liver, pancreas, gut, intestinal flora, but even the human brain. And then it gets really remarkable when you see the turnover rates of all these tissues. They also continuously refurbish and they adapt and they respond. Assuming that, for example, most of the proteins in your brain have an average turnover rate of almost 3 times as high as muscle. So that means if you just make that popular scientific, you have a new brain every 3 weeks. So a lot of the proteins that are now in your brain will actually be completely broken down and built up again over a period of weeks. And still you think you're you. How does that work? It's amazing.
So, listen, you have spent quite a number of years working in the health and wellness space. So, just a slight diversion away from protein. I was just wondering, what are your kind of top general health and wellness tips?
Yeah, that's not going to be very sexy. I spent nearly, I think, 40 million euros of research money in the last 30, 35 years to basically provide clinical evidence that my mom was right on most things. If you have the financial possibility and you're living in a country where this is feasible, have 3 meals a day, be physically active in between those meals, eat a diverse diet. If you eat, sit upright, chew well, and maybe have some milk and cookies before going to bed. It's not that sexy as you'll see on social media.
And what specifically do the milk and cookies do?
I mean, that's not necessarily the cookies, but we've shown that, for example, protein ingestion prior to sleep allows some stimulation of muscle protein synthesis in the night. Now, this is something that is not necessarily for everybody, but it is of interest for people in the hospitals. We can give them more food, but they don't consume the foods. They can't eat a lot when they had surgery, they're in pain, they're recovering. So instead of having the 3 meals, the last meal around 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, and then the next day they have a breakfast. So they spend a very long time in an overnight fasted state where they lose muscle. So we thought it was a good idea to give some protein prior to sleep. So we did some studies with even nasogastric tubes and protein being ingested or administered while they were sleeping. But to make a very long story short, now we finally managed that our hospital brings around some foods, some small foods, protein rich foods in the evening in order to have a longer period where they actually are in a state where they're not in a negative state. And this is, of course, something that athletes do to consume a protein rich snack in the evening to maximize recovery from exercise performed in the evening. And this is something that would also be very relevant for all the people who are recovering from surgery or in a compromised condition.
Can I ask you a general medical question? Not so much intensive care, but clearly there's a lot of people that come into hospital settings and for many reasons aren't as active. And maybe hospital food maybe isn't nutritionally as perfect as it should be. Are there any messages that you would like to say around how we could maybe manage patients and nutrition and exercise and protein intake in hospitals?
I think that's a very good question. And also because sometimes when we talk about patients, we don't think about ourselves. But sooner or later, all of us will be, at some point in time, be a patient. So it's also all of us and all the people listening. We see all those depressing demographics about loss of muscle mass after 40. I think you just said that you were actually after 40, so you're also down the hill already. And I'm also down the hill. But the whole funny thing is that the demographics show muscle loss as we age as a sort of a situation that we just have to accept because of age. But that's not the case. We now believe that most of the muscle loss that we see demographically over the last few decades is actually the impact of short successive periods of reduced physical activity where people lose more muscle than they regain after that situation. Think of a bladder infection, then a COVID, then an elective hip or knee surgery, and then with each episode, people regress. And you've seen this with your parents, maybe your grandparents, that it started with one hospitalization, and then suddenly in the next 8 years, things just went all the way down. So what we need to do is not only have lifestyle interventions where people maintain an active, healthy lifestyle, but also prevent muscle loss during such periods, which is doable because in the hospital, people are underfed. And that's not because the people in the hospitals are not doing their work, because they provide them with enough food, but most of the food is actually not eaten. And a lot of the studies, people look at the food that is being provided, but they don't look at what is actually consumed. So we did a study to see what people are actually consuming. This is not rocket science, but it requires you to take every plate from every patient, weigh everything that is left over, and then calculate how much was being consumed. Now, these healthy patients that came in for elective, self-chosen surgery in order to have a new knee or a new hip, this is a generation that wants to go skiing with their grandchildren. So this is really elective surgery. They consume zero point 0.5 grams of protein per kilogram body mass per day, while estimations of the optimal amount of protein during recovery from surgery is up to between 1.2 and 1.5. So it's only one third of what is considered being optimal. So we have to do something about food intake during hospitalization or during short periods of sickness at home, like a COVID or a flu. That requires normalizing protein intake or normalizing food intake, which is already difficult enough in such a situation. And you can never prevent all muscle loss. Regain it before you actually encounter your next period. So recovering well. Nowadays, people are being sent home very rapidly. And so that recovery and that rehabilitation is often not happening because this is something that people need help for that recovery.
Professor Luc van Loon, thank you so much. This has been absolutely brilliant. We just leave our speaker with one last chance, just to leave the listeners with, one or two or three kind of key messages. What would you want to leave us with today?
In general, what I would advise people, or would actually be a smart advice based on the sciences out there, is consume sufficient protein with each main meal, being around 20 to 25 grams of protein. Now, for most people, evening dinner, that's fine, but a lot of people do not consume enough protein at breakfast. So certainly the people that have a low protein intake can easily improve their protein intake. Think of older people by increasing some protein intake in their breakfast. And of course, always realize that food intake is important, but physical activity drives the food intake. So sufficient physical activity, and that does not mean only walking. It also means recruiting your type 2 fibers, so also doing some strength work. And of course, you don't have to wear lycra and go to a gym. Walking stairs, standing up from the toilet, these types of activities are still essential and they become even more essential when you get older.
Luc van Loon, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome.